Hello students, welcome back. It's time to talk about the Catholic social teaching principle of the preferential option for the poor. This is a principle closely connected to the universal destination of goods because what the universal destination of goods means is that everything that exists is there for the good of the whole human race, not just for one person, two people, a few people. The poor are those who are left out of this. The poor are those who do not have their share of these things that are for the needs of all. The principle of the preferential option for the poor means that although we are called to seek justice for everyone, and we're called to love the love of charity, every single human being, there is a particular way in which we should be attentive to seeking justice for the poor and to loving the poor, to having charity for the poor. Justice means to give each their due. And so we need to make sure that the systems that we have set up in our state, in our world, are such as to help the poor, help people who don't have a fair share of the goods of the earth to have those things that they need to fulfill their own needs. And then charity is love of God above all things for his own sake, and love of neighbor as yourself for the love of God. For every human person, we ought to seek the good for them as much as we do for ourselves. Love them for the sake of God as much as we love ourselves. That is a very challenging and difficult thing to do, but it is something we are called to do above all for the poor, above all for those that Jesus has identified himself with most powerfully, saying that what you do to the least of my brothers, you do it to me, identifying himself with the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the stranger. We are called to love the poor in a particular way because Jesus himself does. There are any number of roots for this principle in the scriptures. I'd like to show just a couple. First, with this parable about the second barn. There's a rich man, he has a really good harvest, so he has another barn built to store it all up so that then he can have a good life and security for the rest of his life. His life is very short. He dies that night. God asks his soul of him, and he calls him a fool because he stored up treasure on earth rather than treasure in heaven. How do you store up treasure in heaven? Well, Jesus goes on to explain later in this same area in Luke 12. Sell your possessions and give alms. Provide yourselves with purses that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. Alms are gifts to the poor. Sell your possessions so you have money to give to the poor, because that's how you're going to have treasure that's not going to rot away. The stuff you put in barns, no matter how comfortable it makes you in this life, is going to be no good to you ultimately because you're going to die. So therefore, give to the poor. That's how you have treasure in heaven. Why? Because to live in heaven, to dwell in heaven, is to dwell in the fullness of love. We live there in love if we lived that way here, if by God's grace we've been transformed to love in the way that Christ loves. Therefore, we should be concerned when we set up systems within our governments, within our economies, that we're concerned always for the needs of the poor, even if that takes something away from us. We should always be concerned to give alms, to give to those who are in need, so that we are storing up treasure in heaven, the treasure of love. Lastly, from Scripture, Christ himself became poor. That is at the heart of the Christian story, that God, who is infinitely rich, because he is infinite being, became a man. He who was strength itself became weak, like human beings are weak. He who was everlasting life accepted a life in which he would have death. He who was wealthy lived as a carpenter's son, was born in a stable, died stripped of everything on the cross. Christ emptied himself, like Paul says in Philippians, taking the form of a slave, that he might dwell among us, becoming poor for our sakes. If Christ has done that, then we must be willing to do the same for our brothers and sisters, despoiling ourselves for the sake of those who are in need. Those who are in charge of the state, the ruling people within whatever government someone lives within, should take care to have a special concern for the poor. Why? Because the rich have lots of ways they can take care of themselves. The rich can hire the best lawyers. The rich can have lobbyists defending their interests. But who's going to do that for the poor unless those who have more do it for them? The people who are wealthy, the people who are in power, have to, in any decision that is made, ask the question and have it be at the front of their consciousness as they make this decision. What is this decision going to do to the poor? Because if it's going to hurt the poor, it is a bad decision. We need to have the preferential option for the poor, meaning we're especially concerned about what happens to them at the level of law and policy, and get rid of whatever injustices may be there. Like we've talked about in the past, the injustice of not having a living wage, the injustice of being made to work under poor conditions, the injustice of poor countries being charged high tariffs by wealthier countries to import products into that nation, protectionism in order to keep the economy of the wealthy nation continuing to boom. Those tariffs, though, also hurt the poor nations that don't give them a place to export these goods, keep them in poverty. That's something that John Paul II in an encyclical particularly condemns. We must be concerned for the poor in every decision made by the government and the economy. It is important to emphasize, as Pope Pius XI does, that justice and charity are both necessary for the common good and for the needs of the poor. On the one hand, as he says very early in the encyclical, if someone says that things should just basically go as they are, if people are getting poor wages, if people are in unjust living conditions, etc., then the solution is just pour money into charity, help people in that way, don't disturb the system. Pius XI says nonsense. There must be a reform of the system itself. Injustice must be done away with. You can't use charity as a band-aid to cover for what is unjust. Nevertheless, you also can't do the opposite. You can't say, okay, I'm just working for a really good system in justice, and therefore we're going to get rid of charity. No, Pope Pius XI and the other popes consistently with him affirm that there's always a need for both justice and charity. You need to reform systems, yes, but you also need to help the people that are suffering right now and not wait for the systemic change to catch up with them. There need to be soup kitchens, shelters, people who are caring for the needs of the poor right now because people need it. Also, it seems true that there will always be the poor with us. As Jesus has said, the poor will always be with you, and that we will need charity, love, to serve those who are in need. Lastly, we need charity, even if you could have the hypothetical situation of shelter, food, etc., all of those needs being met, gainful employment, etc. The popes emphasized, Pius XI as well as Pope Benedict in particular, that even in that case, charity would still be necessary. Love would still be necessary. Because even if all of people's material needs are cared for, people still need love. People still need connection with other people. And justice cannot give that connection, the attachment between different groups of people and between different individuals. Charity, love, is part of the nature of the church. There are three activities that are essential to the nature of the church: the sacraments, the spread of the gospel, evangelization, and service of the poor. And we have a duty to do all three. Jesus is present in all of the above. If you look at the two pictures on this page, Jesus is hidden in both of them. He's hidden under the form of bread in the Eucharist and the monstrance. He's hidden under the form of the poor man in the man sitting there on the street. Jesus is truly present in both places, hidden in the bottom picture under what Mother Teresa called the distressing disguise of the poor. Another important aspect of the preferential option for the poor are the two sets of works of mercy, the corporal works of mercy and the spiritual works of mercy. We'll talk about those in class. You don't need to worry about those right now. God bless you. See you soon. Bye now.